Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's MARC webinar series, which is on the impact of COVID on gambling behaviours, positives, negatives, and vulnerabilities. I'm just going to wait another minute while we let everyone come into the webinar. So just bear with us for a couple of seconds. So welcome everyone to this month's webinar series, the Monash Addiction Research Centre's monthly webinar series. And this week, this month is in the context of Gambling Harm Awareness Week, we're looking at the impact of COVID on gambling behaviours. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands in which we work today and pay my respect to elders, both past, present and future. The aim of the MARC multidisciplinary webinar series is to bring together addiction researchers, clinicians, people with lived experience, and other experts to discuss emerging research challenges and opportunities in the addiction field. This is the third of 4 webinar series that we will be running in 2020. I'll give you some more information at the end, but we'll be running a next symposium on Thursday, the 19th of October at 2 o'clock, which will be on the role of peers in treatment, the latest on research and practice. For this month, we'll be focusing on gambling. And why we focus on gambling? Well, because gambling, as people would know, Australians love to gamble. We spend more per person on gambling than any other country in the world, $242 billion in 2017-18. And it's not surprising that because of that, the gambling industry in Australia is quite large. They pocketed $25 billion, largely from Australians who can least afford it. About 1 in 5 Victorians who gamble experience harm from gambling. And we know there's a major driver of household debt and family and personal dysfunction. And for every person directly experiencing gambling harm, it's estimated at least 6 more people are affected. While Victoria brings in about $2 billion in tax revenue because of gambling, we know that the harms associated with gambling equate to about $7 billion a year, so it's not particularly cost effective. And we know that people who gamble from low-income households bear the brunt of the costs. So one of the reasons for having this seminar today is we know that we are one of the pokey capitals of the world, and that during COVID, there was a shutdown in a lot of activity in those pokey venues, and we thought it would be a great opportunity to hear from key experts in the field around what's been happening during COVID, what can we learn from this, and what should we think about moving forward as key learnings from the pandemic. So we have a stellar cast of speakers today to talk to you. Associate Professor Charles Livingstone, who's head of the Gambling and Social Determinants Unit at Monash University. He teaches health policy, sociology and politics, and is head, as I say, at the Gambling and Social Determinants Unit in the School of Population Health. He has research degrees in economics and social theory, and his principal research interest is in critical gambling studies, including gambling policy reform and the politics, regulation and social impacts of electronic gaming machines. Our second speaker is Dr. Brian Vandenberg, who's a health economist at the School of the Social Sciences at Monash University. He completed his PhD in 2017, which involved an econometric investigation of alcohol pricing and taxation in Australia. His current research interests include the economic and social determinants of alcohol, drug use and gambling. And our final speaker is a discussant, Anna Bardsley, a retired businesswoman, a grandmother, singer, writer, and who lost 10 years of her life to poker machines. It's more than 14 years since she gave any money to the gambling industry. And in 2019, she was recognised as the Victorian Senior of the Year for Healthy and Active Living for her work in gambling reform. And she's a very vocal speaker on the issue of lived experience and the impact of gambling on the population. It's great to have these 3 speakers with us today. And is also the founding member of the 3 Sides of the Coin Theatre Group and works on the Victoria Responsible Gambling Foundation Lived Experience Advisory Committee, and is also employed by the Alliance of Gambling Reform. Just before the speakers start talking, I just wanted to talk briefly about a campaign that we just launched this week. So in November 10 on SBS at starting at 8:30, there's a documentary, Addicted Australia, which will air a 4-part episode showing 10 really brave Australians coming through a treatment program and sharing their experiences and the challenges that they faced along their journey. It's going to be a really fantastic piece of documentary making, a really important insights into addiction and the impact that it has on individuals and family and what treatment can look like. And as part of that documentary series, we've brought together a whole series of different organizations to create a campaign, Rethink Addiction, which calls for an improved national response to addiction treatment. And I really urge you all to sign up to the Twitter account at RethinkAd and to visit rethinkaddiction.org.au and really get behind that campaign in terms of promoting the SBS documentary and calling essentially for a national plan in terms of the treatment of addiction. So really have a look at that, please, and check it out, and we'll come to it at the end. But at this stage, it's my real pleasure to hand over to Charles, who you've all come to listen to, and for his talk today, looking at the impact of COVID on gambling. Please welcome Charles Livingstone.
Hi. Now, I'm going to share my screen. I have a bunch of slides to share with people. I hope we can all see them. Get the presentation up. All right, so together with a bunch of colleagues, what I'm going to report on today is some preliminary results from a survey we did and to discuss the implications of the results of this. Like almost everybody else in the gambling field, it seems we put out a survey during the COVID-19 restrictions. They ended, of course, in New South Wales some time ago and in other states, but they continue, as you know, in Victoria. So my colleagues here collaborated with me. So this is people from our school, the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine, School of Psychology at Monash, and from the Brain and Mind Centre. So firstly, I want to disclose that I don't take money from the gambling industry. I know that this is a long list, but I have the habit of making a point of making sure that I always tell people where I get funding from. I didn't get any money, none of us got any money for this project that I'm going to talk about today, but as you can see, there is a long list, but I think it's important that all of us get into the habit of telling everybody where we get our money from. The other thing I want you to note is that the data in this presentation are awaiting publication, so please do not cite or refer to these prior to publication. And if you want to get a copy of the reference, then email me and I'll send it out to you once it's available. Okay, that's important. Thank you very much. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is what actually happened during the COVID-19 restrictions in Australia. Now, the survey that we did covered all of Australia and it was reasonably voluminous, more details later. So what we're able to do is get some sense of how people responded to the shutdown of terrestrial gambling opportunities. There were some positives, many in fact, and some negatives associated with that. And I also want to talk about the idea of responsible gambling. And I guess the important part of this talk is to talk about what we learnt from the COVID-19 restrictions. What are the implications for public policy moving into the future? Because this has given us an extraordinary opportunity to see what happens when we shut down terrestrial gambling. And of course, the concern is that people will flock back to the pokies as they have in New South Wales when they reopen, or that they will have flopped online and will be getting hooked on internet or app-based gambling. Now, as it says at the top here, New South Wales is always illustrative, sadly, but what we know is that when they opened, I think quite early in June, they got fast-track approval to open up their non-gambling spaces so that they could cram as many machines in as they possibly could and still have some reasonable distance between people. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it meant that EGMs were exposed to children and others. This is certainly what the industry will want to do in Victoria, and it's important to remember that, you know, close to half of regular EGM users are 60 or more, so a high risk for COVID-19 infection apart from the harms of gambling. And we can see from this slide from Club Marconi in Sydney This is their application to move machines out of their normal gambling room areas and into, this is actually the foyer, the entry area into the club. So there's a lot of pressure to open up. Happily, it's been resisted in Victoria, and I don't think we get there until the COVID normal state, but nonetheless, this is one of the things we really need to think about carefully. All right, so when they reopened pokers in New South Wales, with 60% of them operating, revenue jumped significantly. Now, that's hardly a surprise. We always know that there are usually vacant machines, and it just simply means that their utilisation rate increased. But the fact that there was a big jump in revenue suggests that people had, pent up demand. Some of it will have been money laundering. I mean, about 20% of the money that goes through pokers in New South Wales has been estimated by my colleague Francis Markham to be from ANU to be around to be involved with money laundering. So 1/5 of $5 billion. I guess the fact that in New South Wales EGMs are allowed to have $2,500 in them at any one time, they have high maximum bets and are very ubiquitous. But we've also seen rebounds in Queensland and Tasmania. So yet another thing to factor into what we've learned from the shutdown. Now, in Victoria, as many of you will know, the average revenue is about $217 million per month that gets lost on poker machines. As far as we understand it, the earliest that they're likely to open will be late November. That may be delayed. The frantic lobbying of pubs, clubs, casinos, and so on has already commenced. The question that I want to address today really is what happened during the restrictions, what the implications are, and does limiting access have broader public health goals? All right, now the other problem, I guess, is that populations experiencing financial difficulties, like you do in a major recession, are often under a lot of stress, and some may mistakenly believe that they can use gambling as a way of generating income. And of course, there's been plenty of stories that we've heard over the years about how people who are living in difficult circumstances where interpersonal violence or threatening behaviour is occurring will often want to get out at night. So high-risk gambling, for whatever reason, is likely to worsen as the economy dives if poker machines are accessible. That's almost a given, I'm afraid. And given the current economic settings, if I can put on my economic historian hat for a minute, I mean, the reality is that the stimulus package is nowhere near enough to avoid a major recession, and unfortunately, that looks like where we're heading at the moment. I'll put my gambling hat back on again. All right, so when the restrictions were implemented, we administered a survey. We got over 3,000 responses. It was Australia-wide. It was an online survey using QUALITATIVE platform. Importantly, it included, we were able to get responses from 1,927 people who completed both a pre and post PGSI. The PGSI, for those of you who don't know, is a problem gambling severity index. It's regarded as the standard instrument for screening for gambling harm at the moment, and is widely used around the world and certainly in Australia. There were slightly more women than men in our sample, but it also included a large group of 355 high-risk gamblers. In the past, people in that category have been referred to as problem gamblers, but we're trying to change the way we speak about people and refer them now to high-risk gamblers. There was EGM use reported by 920 of our group of 1,927, and about 1.1% of people reported wagering. Okay, people were incentivised by being offered the opportunity to get a $50 gift voucher, but people, of course, were self-selecting. All right, so the headline news, I guess, is that EGM gambling declined dramatically. Okay, so for the general group, 29.1% of the population had reported had reported EGM gambling. That fell to 7.4%. For the high risk group, it went from 70% to 22%. So all of the post-restriction EGM gambling was non-terrestrial. So that includes online or app-based EGMs. Interestingly, participation in all gambling declined. Okay, so the people who did not participate in gambling went from 19% to 49% for the general group, and the people who did participate in gambling declined from 98 to 67%. I'm sorry, that slide's a little bit confusing. So the other and very important change was that the PGSI scores declined significantly. So we went from a mean score, an average score of 3.6 for the general group, down to 1.2, and from an average score of 15.4 to 5. So the average score for the general group more than halved, but the average score for the high risk group declined by 2/3. A very, very significant change in self-reported gambling harm, which is what PGSI is talking about. So for the high risk group, these are the numbers. What you can see, if you look at the pokies in particular, you'll see that there's 3 columns. The first column reports on their principal activity, what they self-reported as their main activity in the 12 months prior. The second column reports on any use reported by the people. They could nominate a principal activity and then report on other activities that they'd partaken of. So as you can see, there was a very significant number of the group who used EGMs. 93% used them at all, and 71% used them as their principal activity. And of course, that declined to 0 because they couldn't get access to them. But the substitution of online apps or app-based pokies was modest. There was some, but it was fairly insignificant. And in fact, if you compare it to any use in the 12 months prior, it was only an increase of 10 people or a couple of percentage points. Now, everyone in the gambling industry tells you that if terrestrial gambling is not available, everyone will flock online. So if you can look at these numbers for yourself, but I think what you'll see is that certainly people went and bought lottery tickets online, although fewer than had previously done so. People were interested in betting, of course, online, and there was certainly a number who did that. But in fact, if you look at it in terms of any use prior in the 12 months, there was actually fewer people betting or reporting to be betting online in both the category of sports and other betting. And although there was some migration to online casino games or app-based casino games, they were insignificant really compared to the others. So the changes in gambling behaviour were all statistically significant, except where there was no change, in which case, of course, they weren't. So what we can say here is that if what we were hoping to see, or what we were expecting to see rather than hoping to see, was a migration online, this didn't actually happen. In fact, almost the opposite. And how did people feel about the closure of pokies venues? So this is, again, the high risk group, the people scoring 8 or more on the PGSI. And as you can see, some of them were stressed or anxious, unhappy or upset, annoyed or frustrated, but more of them were relieved, thankful or grateful, and positive or happy. So what we can see is that certainly there was some stress involved in the closure of in the closure of terrestrial gambling venues, but for the most part, people welcomed that closure quite strongly, which is a very interesting finding. So what are the implications of this? Well, as in Norway, many of you may know that in the mid-2000s, the Norwegian government acquired all of the EGMs in that country and initially detuned them a little bit by taking out banknote acceptors and so on, and then eventually shut them all down for 18 months. And when they reopened, they replaced them with a much more limited number of custom-made devices, which were considerably less intense in their operation. So as in Norway, there was some migration to non-terrestrial products, but there was not enough to substitute for the previous use of terrestrial and an online gambling combined. There was a significant decline in the post-restriction PGSI scores, and we also got data on time spent and money spent on gambling, and we noted that 57% of our group reported less expenditure. That's the PGSI 8+ group, and there was self-reported positivity around the closure of venues. So, contrary to popular belief, actually physically limiting access is a possibly highly effective harm prevention / minimisation intervention. Now, the industry, as I said earlier, generally argues that closure or limiting access to terrestrial venues is ineffective. And the argument they have goes that people will migrate online. Our results suggest that that's not true. There was no real increase in online betting. And the largest post-restriction activity was no gambling. So the biggest single group in both the general group and the PGSI 8+, the high risk group, was that people declined to gamble. They stop gambling altogether. Now, what do we do about this? So the problem we have is that, as many of you will know, responsible gambling is the mantra which generally directs policy in this area at the moment. Now, responsible gambling was an idea coined originally by industry. It transfers responsibility to individuals. The dangerous gambling products that are marketed without effective regulation, and they're regarded as immutable. So, you know, the problem, in a sense, is seen to be that of people who they call problem gamblers. So I would argue, and I think increasingly many of my colleagues argue, that a public health oriented approach is needed, a real one, not a pretend one. That would reduce the harms of specific games by firstly altering structural characteristics. And on the basis of what this survey and our research is showing, reducing accessibility would be a very important tool to help people who don't want to gamble. Now, we don't actually even have to necessarily reduce physical accessibility. We can provide appropriate technical tools that will replicate the shutdown, that allow people to make a choice not to gamble, which means that we can do what they're doing in many Scandinavian countries now, which is requiring people who want to gamble on high-risk gambling products to register and utilise a pre-commitment system, so that if they decide they don't want to gamble or they want to limit their gambling to $20 a week or whatever, by a combination of registration and pre-commitment, that would actually be, for the first time, an effective way. So essentially what we would be doing in that way would be to replicate what had occurred during the shutdown. So I think the implications of what we've seen during the shutdown are that most people welcomed it, particularly the high risk group, that they spent less, that their harm levels reduced substantially, and that there was not a widespread migration to online gambling. Very positive development. And that's the end of my story. Now, I think I'm supposed to hand over to my colleague, Brian Vandenberg. Brian is a wonderful person and a very distinguished scholar, and I'm sure he's got a lot to tell us.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Charles, and thank you very much to the Monash Addiction Research Centre for hosting this webinar today. My presentation is focused on one specific aspect of gambling harm, which is homelessness. In the time I've got today, I'd like to present some brand new research findings on gambling and homelessness from a study recently completed and not yet published. So similar to Charles, if you could please follow the usual caveats with not citing the research until it's published, but get in touch with me if you'd like some more information about the research and our publication plans. My co-investigators are Charles Livingstone, as well as Kerry O'Brien, Adrian Carter, and myself, all from Monash University. So a link between gambling and homelessness is not surprising. There's considerable research showing that harm from gambling, particularly financial harm, falls disproportionately on socioeconomically vulnerable groups. And psychoeconomic theories of poverty show that the stress and strain of living in poverty contributes to harmful behaviours such as gambling that set up a cycle of economic decision-making that reinforce poverty. Homelessness, it's one of the most catastrophic harms associated with gambling because it's really difficult to recover from, if not impossible for many. It often affects more than just the individual. It affects many others, including family and friends, and sometimes the effects are long-term and intergenerational. However, despite the known link between gambling and homelessness, there's very little research in this area. We undertook an exploratory study, therefore, to investigate the link between gambling and homelessness, and we looked at particularly the link among older people in Victoria. Now, our focus on older people was motivated by evidence of increasing presentations of older people at gambling support services in Victoria. as well as also evidence that older people are representing an increasingly large proportion of the homeless population in Australia. And we define older people for the purposes of our study as those aged 50+ years. So this is younger than the definition of older people typically used in gambling studies, but it accounts for the premature aging and premature mortality of people who are homeless. We adopt the widely used Australian definition of homelessness, which recognises different severities of homelessness from primary through secondary and tertiary homelessness. So right from sleeping rough on the street up to living in insecure housing without a secure lease, for example. Because there's been very little research in Australia on the link between gambling and homelessness, and none in Victoria for about 15 years, we undertook a study that was very exploratory in nature, because our aim was to quickly gather some insights about the link between gambling and homelessness. We had two main components. First of all, we undertook a rapid review of the literature, and secondly, we undertook a qualitative study, which is what I'll mostly present on today. I should say that all of our data was collected before the COVID-19 pandemic arrived in Victoria. So our findings should be considered in that context. But later in the presentation, I'll touch briefly on how COVID-19 may be impacting on older people experiencing gambling and homelessness, particularly in a Victorian context. But first, just let me summarise the key findings from our rapid review component of the study, where we looked at the existing research on gambling and homelessness. We found only 57 articles in the peer-reviewed literature, and most of these were quantitative studies using very small samples of homeless populations. So from the literature, it's very difficult to generalise about the findings. And there's only less than a handful of studies that actually looked at specifically gambling and homelessness in older people. But in terms of the general findings from the literature, it appears that a large proportion of the homeless population do not gamble at all. However, those who do gamble are more likely to be harmful gamblers or high-risk gamblers. The prevalence of harmful gambling in homeless populations is also very often higher than it is in the general community. And that's a consistent finding across studies undertaken in Europe as well as North America. A causal relationship between gambling and homelessness has not been rigorously investigated, but the relationship between gambling and homelessness from the research we've got appears to be a bidirectional relationship. Now, the research also shows a range of factors contribute to the relationship, including individual factors such as mental illness, substance use and trauma, as well as interpersonal factors such as relationship breakdown, community factors such as the accessibility of gambling, and also broader structural factors such as poverty. So overall, the research aligns with those psychoeconomic theories of how poverty affects stress and how this contributes to harmful gambling behaviour. So in summary, our rapid review of the literature found that while there's evidence that gambling and homelessness do co-occur, and old people are often more at risk, there's very little research on how gambling and homelessness are linked and how the contributing factors operate, as well as a limited amount of evidence on how current services appropriately respond. So in light of the rapid review findings, we decided to undertake a qualitative study to give us a more in-depth and contextual understanding of the link between gambling and homelessness in Victoria. In particular, we wanted to look at the underlying conditions and the causal mechanisms of gambling and homelessness. We had four main study questions. First of all, how are gambling and homelessness linked among older people? How do individual, structural and other factors contribute to their link? How do homelessness services currently identify, understand and respond to co-occurring gambling and homelessness? And how can service responses be improved to prevent and minimise the harm associated with gambling and homelessness in older people? Our method followed some well-established approaches in qualitative research on complex issues such as gambling and homelessness. Theoretically, we approached the issue from a critical realist perspective, which meant we aimed to identify the possible underlying causes and associated mechanisms and conditions that have the potential to bring about gambling and homelessness. We recruited a sample of key informants who were workers in support services for people experiencing gambling and homelessness. So in this initial exploratory study, we did not recruit individuals who have lived experience themselves of gambling and homelessness. We conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews, all of them face-to-face because we were able to do this before the COVID-19 pandemic reached Victoria. Each interview was approximately 45 minutes. All the interviews were audio recorded and then transcribed verbatim, and we performed a thematic analysis of the transcripts from the interviews. In terms of the types of key informants, well, these were currently people working in service provision for people experiencing or at risk of gambling and homelessness across three key sectors: aged care, primary care, and also specialist homelessness services. And I'd really like to thank and acknowledge all of those organisations that agreed very generously to give their time to participate in our study across both metropolitan Melbourne and also regional Victoria. So from the thematic analysis of the interviews with the key informants, we identified four main themes. In summary, participants believe that gambling and homelessness among older people is often linked, but the relationship is very complex. We found two very different routes through which gambling and homelessness are linked. So we heard evidence of gambling contributing to homelessness. We also heard evidence of homelessness contributed to gambling. So in other words, the relationship appears to be bidirectional. We also heard a range of key contributing factors and also important ways that services currently respond to gambling and homelessness. So this diagram shows graphically how the main themes we identified interrelate. As shown in the grey box to the left of centre, we heard that gambling often occurs among older people experiencing long-term homelessness, but their gambling was often hidden and because of this was often overlooked by services. As shown by the other grey box to the right of centre, we also heard that high-intensity gambling involving rapid losses and ultimately financial ruin often led to older people becoming homeless for the first time in later life. So I'd just like to unpack each of the four themes just a little bit and by providing some extracts from the interviews that we coded to each theme. So in terms of theme one, several participants gave examples among older people, gambling among older people experiencing long-term homelessness. But many felt that the gambling in this population was often hidden, and because it was so often hidden and concealed, service providers felt that themselves and other services often overlooked it. For example, one participant said, "I reckon it's hidden. It's probably much more pronounced than what we think it is. It's just that people don't talk about it that much." And another said, "Unfortunately, in homelessness services, I don't think we ask, enough questions about it. I think it's very hidden. It's not sort of in any assessment forms I see for housing and for other things. It's not top priority." In terms of theme two, several participants gave examples of how rapid financial losses and financial ruin from high-intensity gambling contributed to older people becoming homeless, newly homeless for the first time in their life. So the examples of high intensity gambling they referred to included pokie machines and online sports betting. Relationship breakdown was often referred to as something that occurred concurrently in many of these cases of first-time homelessness in later life. And we heard several examples where major life changes or crises were an underlying trigger for gambling and the harm that led to them subsequently becoming homeless. For example, one participant said, he is estranged from his wife and 2 children because they say he'd lost all their money through gambling. So that's what led to kind of family breakup. And then he was homeless for a little bit. Another said he was living with his mum. His mum died. He inherited the whole house. He gambled it away. He lost the house. In terms of theme 3, several participants believe that multiple and complex factors often contribute to gambling and homelessness occurring among older people. Fundamentally, participants believe that poverty was an important factor that contributed to people gambling when they were homeless, and that gambling also reinforced their poverty and their homelessness. But individual factors were also seen as important. For example, one participant said, the other thing we hear from clients too is that the link between their substance use and gambling. So they're more likely to gamble after either using alcohol. The conditions of people who are homeless was also seen as a factor that contributed to their gambling. For example, one participant said, I think the state of the rooming houses, that would make you go and spend some time elsewhere, where it was air conditioned. We heard this a lot from participants, that gambling venues provide shelter, safety, food, drinks, comfort, and amenities for someone who is homeless. Many participants also believe that gambling venues were an opportunity for someone who was homeless to feel socially connected with others and be treated as an equal. Many also said that gambling venues provide a temporary escape from the harsh realities of homeless life. So the link between gambling and homelessness is very complicated. In this diagram, we've tried to graphically depict the complex relationship between gambling and homelessness and showing the range of conditions and generative mechanisms in that link between gambling and homelessness based on our use of a critical realist analysis of the data. We identified clusters of individual, interpersonal and structural conditions which, when they're activated, they can become part of the causal mechanism for co-occurring gambling and homelessness to happen. Some of the conditions appear to aggravate gambling and homelessness, as well as result from gambling and homelessness, for example, poverty and comorbidities. So this diagram really acknowledges that the directionality between gambling and homelessness in many cases is very difficult to untangle. So returning now to the fourth of our 4 themes, recognising and responding to gambling and homelessness among older people. In terms of this theme, several participants believe that we need to build a public health approach to gambling and homelessness among older people. And that central to this needs to be better recognising of gambling issues among homeless people in the first place. Therefore, a priority we identified is to expand screening and early detection of gambling issues across the population of older people who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. A further priority is increasing access to financial counselling services for older people who are homeless, because many participants saw this as an effective way to not only provide financial counselling support, but also potentially uncover and address gambling issues that may at first be hidden. Additionally, building capacity in the homelessness services workforce to increase their confidence and their skills to recognise, respond and refer gambling issues among older people experiencing homelessness is also needed. And of course, there's a need for more research building on this exploratory study to build the evidence base around gambling and homelessness to inform policy and programs. I just now like to really briefly touch on how the link between gambling and homelessness might be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's not something we investigated in our study because we collected all of our data before the COVID-19 pandemic arrived in Victoria. So obviously further research is needed to fully understand how COVID-19 has impacted the link between gambling and homelessness. But we can probably start to anticipate what some of the possible impacts might be. In terms of gambling behaviour, it's likely that the restrictions on terrestrial gambling that Charles has described have reduced gambling in some parts of the homeless population. But at the moment, it's unclear whether homeless individuals have used the shutdown as an opportunity to stop gambling and whether or not they've actually used the opportunity to access gambling support services. A big concern looming, of course, is the reopening of terrestrial gambling throughout Victoria in the near future, which may see some homeless individuals return to harmful gambling and also may see some individuals who've become homeless commence harmful gambling for the first time, for many as they emerge from a long period of isolation. In terms of homelessness, well, it's important to recognise first and foremost that homeless persons have an elevated vulnerability to COVID-19 because of their underlying poor health. Additionally, for many living through the pandemic and who are homeless, it's been harder because of that main message about staying home, which is obviously problematic, both in a practical sense if you're homeless, but also because it's probably further stigmatised their homeless situation. Fortunately, in Victoria, we've seen an unprecedented effort to house the homeless population during COVID-19 through state government providing temporary shelter in hotels and private rental properties, which apparently has been extended until early next year. But this is likely to have added to new challenges for many homeless people. It's probably exacerbated social isolation, and no doubt it's restricted access to services that they need. Also, homeless services themselves are likely to come under new pressure to assist people as those services themselves move to operate in a COVID-safe way, and also as more people become newly homeless during the pandemic and the recession that follows. The supply of low-cost housing is also under new pressure from people who have recently become unemployed during the pandemic or needing to escape violent homes, for example. And this is going to further marginalise those who are already homeless and vulnerable. So not surprisingly, a recent report published in The Lancet highlighted that both gambling and homelessness are public health priority issues that we need to closely monitor as we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And if you've got any questions, please pop them in through Zoom. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, who is actually the discussant for this webinar, which is Anna Bardsley. So over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks for inviting me, Dan and the team at Monash. Thank you to Charles and Brian and all of you involved in research on this tough topic of gambling harm. It means a lot to people like me who've been personally harmed by gambling. Thank you for listening to our stories, for holding them and putting them together to bring this data that backs up what we stand up and say. Thank you for moving away from the shaming language such as problem gamblers. And Charles, thanks for the roundabout responsible gambling, because now I don't have to do it. Because that language around that the industry has thrown out there and is commonly used has made help seeking so much more difficult for me and so many others. Because if it's about personal responsibility, then I should just get my act together and fix this myself. I know a lot of people who gambled, who still gamble. They were and are all in the high risk category. I was. And it's hidden because of the shame. Nobody knew when I was gambling, nobody knew the extent of what I was living through and what I was doing and how bad it made me feel. I did a very good job of just living and presenting like an ordinary woman living in the suburbs with her family. Didn't look any different than I look now. I'm happier now, much happier now. And gambling, remember, please, always, that gambling isn't only about losing money, it's about losing relationships, time, self-esteem, and so much more. And the data that I've been listening to, as I was listening to both Brian and Charles, the faces of the people I know were coming up. The faces of the people I know who have lost their houses, who now have to live in somebody else's place or had to go into shared accommodation, who couch surfed, who never had the opportunity to buy a house because they gambled it all when they were young, who spent their super so they have nothing to live on in their older age. And what's happening now with COVID is this is, as we all know, I mean, the word unprecedented is being used over and over and over and again, and it is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. And we've had the chance here in Victoria to see, because that's where I live, what a world without poker machines is like again, because I'm old enough to remember what it was like before the poker machines came. And it was bloody sight better than it is now. And I want to tell you a little story that yesterday I had my grandson staying with me. He's homeschooling and was having trouble at home. So he came to me. He's been here for 5 weeks and he went for a bike ride yesterday and fell off his bike. He rang me and said, can you come and pick me up? And he was in the car park of the local pub. So I drove down to pick him up. And as I drove in, there were no cars in the car park. And I looked around and I thought, wow, this is what it looks like with nobody in the pokies room, nobody there. And I don't want the pubs to be closed and nobody in there. I'm not against pubs, I'm just against poker machine rooms. And let's not call them gaming lounges. That's another word that the industry likes you to use because it sounds softer. It's not gaming, it's gambling. And so the people I know, the stories that I'm hearing, the first one I heard was from a friend who had talked to me several times about her granddaughter before COVID hit, about her concerns for her granddaughter, who was gambling more than she could afford, who was gambling to excess, and it was harming her and her family. She couldn't pay her bills. She was constantly asking to borrow money from her grandmother, from other family members. She was evicted from where they were living, she and her children. And I met her at Easter, early in COVID. And she was beaming from ear to ear. And she said to me, you would not believe it. She said, my granddaughter she can pay the bills. And this Easter, she finally had the money to buy Easter eggs without having to borrow any from any of us. And the whole family was happy. And I was beaming because I had been through listening to her tell her of her fear and her distress over her granddaughter's gambling. And the granddaughter wanting to stop but not knowing how to. And that was a familiar story. I have friends from a group that I used to be in years ago who are still gambling. And their responses are very much along the lines of what Charles was talking about. One of them two of them haven't gambled at all because they both gambled in pubs and clubs. And another one has gone online to use poker machines online. And I find it so interesting. One of the three really can't wait for them to open. And she knows she doesn't really want to gamble. She knows it's dumb, but she can't wait for them to open because the pull is there. And I have to say that while I think it's fabulous that the places have been closed for this long, it wouldn't have been long enough to rewire my brain. It took me years to rewire my brain to the point where I could say, don't care, don't think about it. Gambling isn't an option anymore. So somehow doing something to restrict opening hours, to reduce opening hours, to give people who are the users of the products, and again, let's not call them players because it's not a game, the people who are using the products, as Charles was saying, to have some control themselves, to give them the control of how they're interacting with a product. Let's put some warning labels on them. So as far as what's going on in COVID, it really is a mixed bag. I feel deeply I feel so deeply for people who aren't yet free enough, who must be wondering what's going to happen. When are they going to open? I can sense their anticipation. And when I look at the local pub, I think, wow, what would it be like if their business model wasn't reliant on harming the local community with gambling harm? What if they focused on food and entertainment, real entertainment? So I think we have the opportunity to make some serious change if we have the will for it. And as a community, we need to have the will. So I could tell you stories forever. I know a lot of them, and I'm happy to do that. But I hope you've got some idea of what it means to me. I would love the idea that at 9 o'clock in the morning, the only cars in the car park of the local pubs and clubs with the kitchen staff prepping for lunch, not people standing outside waiting, just in anticipation of them being open. I'd like to see that all the lights off at 3 o'clock in the morning. I've been there at 3 o'clock in the morning. Nothing good happens in there at 3 o'clock in the morning. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me. We have a few questions, I think, which I will put to you. There are 3 here. Denise has asked, can the purchase of lottery tickets be addressed in regard to people who say, I don't gamble, yet purchase lottery tickets regularly? Thank you. Is there anybody here, Charles or Brian, would you like to address that question? I can say I think it's gambling. It's that sense of wanting to win something and solve your problems by, something wonderful coming down out of the sky, the jackpot. Another question, many AFL clubs have had gambling as a featured presence in their club rooms. Some have stopped, many have not. How can the general public bring change in stopping gambling about from sporting clubs?
Can I just address the lottery issue?
Sure.
So what we know from the available data is that the rates of harm associated with lottery ticket users are relatively low. So the sort of harm rate is just above the population harm rate, about 1.1% compared to a population rate of about 1%. Now that doesn't mean that no one gets harmed, but if all you're doing is buying lottery tickets, which is always, of course, a form of gambling, but if all you're doing is buying lottery tickets, then the chances of getting into a lot of trouble are not great. But that's not to say that no one gets into trouble. That people don't get into trouble with lottery tickets. They certainly do, and they can be dangerous. And that's particularly increasingly the case these days, where there has been a bit of a switch to online lottery purchases, and there are lotteries available on a daily basis now. So I think I think the response to that is to make sure we understand exactly what's happening with lottery users and keep an eye on it. But I think the main problem we need to be concerned with at this stage are pokey gambling and online wagering. They're far and away the biggest causes of harm. And
pokies is still the largest contributor to gambling harm?
By a very significant margin. So if you just look at it in terms of revenue, pokies contribute about 15 billion of Australia's 25 billion, and horse and sports wagering combined is about another 5 billion, and lotteries are a couple of billion. So, I mean, these are big numbers, of course, but in terms of the amount of gambling consumption, the pokies are still the biggest problem area, and certainly from what I hear from the help services, they are still the cause of most people's gambling harm.
And what about AFL clubs? Have had gambling as a featured presence?
Well,
I mean, about that?
Well, the interesting thing is that that's now changing quite dramatically. And I mean, one of the interesting things with the GWS in Sydney competing against the rugby league scene up there, where of course they are inextricably linked with gambling rooms. The decision, they made an explicit decision not to get into gambling as a fundraising area. They saw it as, I guess, tarnishing their brand. So in the end, I believe they actually got into a childcare service as a way of raising revenue. They branded a childcare service, and they seem to be doing okay with that. But they made an explicit decision not to join the rugby league scene in Sydney with pokie gambling everywhere. There's certainly still clubs that have a connection with pokie gambling. There's no doubt about that. Essendon, Hawthorn, etc. in Melbourne. And but we also know that Geelong, the Melbourne Footy Club, Collingwood have all got out of pokie gambling and have severed their ties also with online gambling. To my mind, the most important message that the AFL could send would be to stop its ties with the online wagering sector, which they continue with rather. I mean, most of the clubs, or many of the clubs, have now severed such ties, but the AFL continues to. And I think it is more than a little hypocritical for them to argue that the players have this sort of duty of care not to gamble on any aspect of the game, and yet the AFL itself is in bed with the bookies, so to speak.
Yeah, and I have deep concerns about the combination of gambling and sport for our young people. I have grandsons, and they love sport. And as a former businesswoman, I know the gambling industry sees them as a future market. And no.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And I think, look, you know, I mean, if we were serious about constraining gambling harm, the first step we would take, as with tobacco, would be to prohibit sponsorship by gambling companies and get rid of the gambling advertising. I mean, that would be a massive step forward, I think.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so there's a question about warning labels. Hang on, I've got a phone ringing here. I'm going to tell go away. Warning labels have not deterred some people from smoking and or using nicotine. What's the percentage of effect hoped for on poker machines?
Well, if I can answer that again, I mean, we did a study a few years ago about the existing so-called harm minimisation policies that operated in gambling rooms, and there's no studies that actually estimate the effect of warning signs. Simply none. There's no data, no evidence that they have any effect at all. My sense is that their effect is minimal, and most of the gamblers I've ever spoken to just tell me that they either ignore them or that makes them feel even more ashamed, but they are highly ineffective. That's not to say that we shouldn't have signs which actually accurately describe the effects of poker machine gambling or whatever, but we don't have any regulation around that. And I think it'd be much better if the information was accurate and provided a detailed breakdown of what you would expect to lose in a certain gambling pattern and that sort of thing.
It always struck me that I had no idea I was engaging with an addictive product. That if I'd had a warning that said this product is designed to addict, maybe I might have made a different decision. I might not have, but maybe. The stuff that was in the signs and stuff that was in venues when I was gambling was more shame-inducing than helpful. Yeah. So, and we've got two more questions. If gambling is an addiction, how did this lockdown impact when people stopped cold turkey withdrawal symptoms? Did your study show any of that?
Look, we got some free text commentary, and most of that was positive, and it was largely asserting that people felt that it had been a very liberating experience for them. Now, that's not to say that, look, if we look at our data around how did you feel, there was certainly a number of people who felt unhappy and stressed by the closure of pokie venues, terrestrial gambling venues generally. And so my sense is that they would have experienced quite, you know, the symptoms of any withdrawal from a intense addictive behaviour. But the majority of people didn't report that. In fact, the majority of people seem to have reported feeling of very positive about the closure. And certainly anecdotes I've had both from people contacting me directly and hearing people talking on radio shows when I've been commenting on them. Basically, you know, people ring in to say how overjoyed they were that the pokies had shut. It gave them a chance to reset their life. And I think, as you said, Anna, one that sort of broke my heart was a lady saying she'd been gambling for years, and this is the first Easter she'd been able to buy her kids Easter eggs, etc.
And I'm hearing the same stories, Charles. Mostly that people are relieved. They were and are relieved the decision's been taken away from them, and yeah, and the responses to them opening up again is mixed. But
Yep.
and people not having realised exactly how much they were actually losing until they weren't losing it anymore, that they were surprised by how much money they had in the bank and
Yep.
what they could do with it. So, yeah. So thank you. I think it's time for me to hand back to Dan. And there's a question here, Dan. Can you see the questions about repeating the time of the Rethink Addiction documentary?
I will. Thanks so much, Anna.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Now, we could have a conversation all afternoon about this because there is so much to talk about, and it's been really fantastic to hear the three of you present today and to really, tell us, what the latest is happening in the world of gambling, particularly in these unprecedented times, and the opportunities that brings. As Charles has said, huge opportunity in terms of understanding what would happen if things weren't open all the time. And as Anna, you said, your stories were, really touching in terms of the impact that it's had on people who struggle to control their gambling. So thanks so much for the three. Can I take this opportunity to thank Anna, Charles and Brian for presenting today. Really insightful presentations on the impact of COVID on gambling. All our talks are put on our YouTube channel and they'll be available very soon for those people who might have missed it. At this opportunity, can I just close off by telling you about our next Mark Symposium, which will be on Thursday, the 9th of November. So put that in your diary, and really leveraging all the stuff that Anna's talking about. It's really the importance of lived experience and peer support in treatment. And so we'll be hearing from Heather Pickard, the CEO of Shark, Crystal Clancy, who's a coordinator of peer projects, and Associate Professor Victoria Manning will talk about the evidence of peer support in treatment, a really important update about what the evidence says and how you actually apply peer support work within treatment services. So a really important date, please put it in your diary. And just a final plug for Rethink Addiction. So this is a campaign we launched this week. We've got about over 50 organisations who are putting their hand up to be part of this. So we're slowly bringing everyone on board. But this is in preparation for the SBS documentary in November, which will really, we hear from 10 brave individuals telling their story. And we want to really amplify that to hear so many other stories that are happening across Australia, and for a call to action to make addiction a national priority and to create a national roadmap and to have a dedicated research and treatment fund to make sure that addiction is treated like any other health disorder. So please go to rethinkaddiction.org.au and all other social media outlets. So at this point, I'd just like to thank all our speakers today again, and to thank Kelly for organising today's meeting, and to thank you all for giving us your time today to hear some really fantastic thoughts and insights around the impact of COVID on gambling. Thank you, and see you again in a month's time.